Changes in the Land, Indians, Colonists, and the Ecology of New England by William Cronon. Presented by Jason Ix, Emily Warren, Taylor Fry, Drew Corder, and Sidney Cruz. I take infinite pains to know all the phenomena of the spring. For instance, thinking that I have here the entire poem, and then, to my chagrin, I hear that it is but an imperfect copy that I possess and have read, that my ancestors have torn out many of the first leaves and grandest passages, and mutilated it in many places. I should not like to think that some demigod had come before me and picked out some of the best stars. I wish to know an entire heaven and an entire earth. Henry David Thoreau, The Journal, 1837 to 1861. William Cronon's Changes in the Land is an ecological history of the New England area. He talks about the environmental changes that occurred in the area from 1600 through the 1800s. He brings to light some of the major impacts that both the Native Americans and the British colonists had on the ecosystems of New England. In just a short time, the Europeans had managed to change the landscape more rapidly than the Native Americans had done in thousands of years. Using techniques and living arrangements they had brought with them from back home, Europeans lived in fixed settlements and viewed land as a commodity. Native Americans used practices such as subsistence, whereas the European focus was on the accumulation of stuff and property. The decreasing populations of the Native Americans and the increasing populations of the colonists added a major change to the landscape.
The struggle was over two ways of living and using the seasons of the year. It expressed itself in how two peoples conceived of property, wealth, and boundaries on the landscape. Native Americans saw property as something for immediate use. What was in their possession belonged to them, or to the tribe as a whole, but was not something to keep indefinitely. The Europeans' sense of property was far different from that of the Indians. The colonists believed they owned an item even if it was not in their direct possession at that moment. Starvation was not a big issue for the Indians in the New England area. They had adapted over many years to be able to go longer periods of time without stored-away food. The colonists had even wondered why they would not set aside more food for the winter months. The Europeans, on the other hand, were very susceptible to starvation. Their lifestyle had not prepared them for the harsh winters that New England had in store for them. The English thought the Native Americans' way of living was lazy. They perceived their unwillingness to stay in one area and work hard to keep it as a reason to take their land. How could people possess a land if they're unwilling to stay with it and stake their claim? Europeans also believed that Indians were lazy because activities like hunting and fishing, in their eyes, were only for leisure. The Native American way of growing crops was also seen as a waste because they moved so often. Another point of distaste developed from the hard-working Native American woman. The colonists could not understand why the women worked so hard and the men allocated their time and energy towards leisurely activities. The Indians were also portrayed as poor due to the Europeans' own perceived standards of acquiring and possessing items.
Europeans viewed nature as an object of conquest. Following biblical texts, Genesis 1:28 says, quote, "And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth." The introduction of microorganisms spelled certain doom for the native populations who had never experienced the diseases that colonists brought with them from Europe. Cronon states that roughly 80 to 90% of the indigenous people perished, which would eventually change the structure of their family units forever. Europeans had built up immunities to these organisms over long periods of time. For example, they were not as susceptible to the common cold as their Indian counterparts. The lack of dense populations had kept the Native Americans safe for centuries. Massive amounts of death caused tribal groups to miss planting and harvesting cycles, which in turn led to colossal starvation. The deaths of the native population led most of the Europeans to believe that they were meant to have the land then. Death, disease, money, and politics led to a major transformation of the social structure of the native people. Vast amounts of wampum pig were introduced to the Indians via trade. Before trading with the Europeans, Native Americans had only used wampum in a way that favored the more prestigious members of the tribe. Now everyone had equal access to wampum, which caused its value to drop. Also, the introduction of metal objects into the European trade markets kept the Native Americans on the hook for items that were once not considered necessities.
Eventually, the fur trade led to overhunting of many animals that the Indians had relied on for thousands of years. This also had consequences because eventually they had to rely on European cloth for clothing due to the overhunting of fur. Eventually, the sedentary lifestyle of the Europeans led to the Indians having to start doing the same thing. Artificial boundaries set up by the Europeans led to major disaster in lifestyles for the indigenous populations. Having to live close to one another, disease spread faster than ever, which changed the way Indians had once treated the ones they loved. Deforestation was another issue that had also become a major problem. Native Americans themselves had cleared forests, but not the same way as the Europeans. Native people burnt large areas, but only in the ways that helped them. They cleared forests for the purpose of farming and for hunting. The Europeans, on the other hand, used forests for timber for ships, rosin and pitch, and many other things. They used certain types of lumber for specific purposes, even marking some of the timber for the crown only. The landscape had changed so drastically that someone from the 1600s would not have recognized it in the 1800s. Their farming practices, which seemed to be influenced by their faith, eventually led to infertile lands. The deforestation had long-lasting impacts on future generations. The lack of wood eventually led to increases in the price of fuel, which caused the need for coal later down the line. The clearing of land also had a huge impact on the soil. Nitrogen fixation became a huge issue due to the fact that less plant life removed these much-needed nutrients from the land. Eventually, all of these issues culminated in the erosion of the soil and massive flooding. The need to plow the lands as a result of soil compaction led to erosion as well.
Another issue that caused a lot of problems was the issue of how Europeans used livestock. Native Americans only thought they owned an animal once they had killed it. Europeans, on the other hand, thought they owned anything they deemed fit all year round until they had use of it. Also, the overgrazing that followed changed the landscape for the worse. Native Americans killed pretty much anything that came on their land which Europeans took issue with pretty fast. The colonists had enacted laws trying to mitigate some of the issues with the livestock, but most failed. The colonists had also tried, when acting these laws, to try to enforce them between towns so that way no town is left unpaid for any livestock that had been killed. Eventually, the fence became a permanent scar on the landscape. Also, the need to move livestock from one place to another meant the need for roads. Roads led to more clearing, and eventually, the clearing of the land led to even more erosion. In the end, misunderstanding of each side's culture has led to many of the issues that followed. One side only using what they needed, and the other using more than they could produce. Introduction of disease led to the destruction of the Native Americans' way of life. Plus, the introduction of the capitalist way of doing business had also spelled doom for the Indians. Eventually, the destruction of the land led the indigenous people to have to either move on, die, or assimilate into a culture they did not understand.